Welcome, everybody, to our program this afternoon with Ambassador Oh Joon. He's the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea at the United Nations in New York. And I should introduce myself. I'm Tom Byrne, the new president of the Korea Society. I'll continue to use that modifier "new" until I've passed my first 100 days on the job, and that's still a ways to go for that. So Ambassador Oh Joon is serving as the president of the Economic and Social Council, the ECOSOC for those in government who love acronyms, for a one-year term, and this began on July 24th, 2015. I should say, just to give you some background about ECOSOC, is that it's one of the six organs established by the UN Charter. And of course, the UN Charter is celebrating its 70th anniversary. President Park Geun-hye was here back in October to, September, about a month ago, to give a talk to address the United Nations. So ECOSOC is one of the six organs of the UN, just as the Security Council is, the General Assembly, and the International Court of Justice. It's a hugely important job, and so we're very grateful and honored to have Ambassador Oh here. In addition, Ambassador Oh serves as the president of the Conference of States Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. He also served as president of the Security Council from May 2014 during the 2013-2014 term. Prior to this position, he was ambassador to the Republic of Korea in Singapore from 2010 to 2013. We actually overlapped in Singapore. I was working in Singapore at the time. And Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Seoul from 2008 to 2010. Ambassador Oh joined the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1978 and has served as special advisor to the foreign minister, the ROK Embassy in Brazil, Deputy Director General for Policy Planning. He was in Malaysia, also at the United Nations. He has received from the Republic of Korea, the government of the Republic of Korea. He has been awarded the Order of Service Merit twice, and the Order of Green Stripes in 1996 and Order of Yellow Stripes in 2006. Ambassador Oh has a master's degree in international policy studies from Stanford University, a diploma from the London School of Economics and Political Science, a bachelor in French literature from Seoul National University. He also was a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a member of the Korea Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum 2010 to 2013, another very important job. So I'll turn the program over to Ambassador Oh, and he will give a presentation. At the end, I believe we'll have some time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Tom. I didn't know you haven't passed 100 days mark yet. You're really new. I think you can use the term new at least for a year. Well, I've been here many times, but today I realized that Korea society is really Korean. Instead of having brown bag lunch, we have a nice lunchboxes, which cost more healthy. I was in Washington, D.C. last week, and I spoke at another meeting on Korean Peninsula issues, and I asked the convener if Chatham House rules are applied, and then I looked up and saw many cameras rolling, so much for the Chatham House rules there. But because YTN is here, I guess no more Chatham House rule here either, I guess. But anyway, the issue is safe for me. Last week when I spoke that was at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. When I spoke there, I was reported on many Korean media. Not exactly the way I would like to be reported, but that was because the issue was about North Korea. But this has nothing to do with North Korea, and this is in a way much more important issue for all humanity than North Korea is. I'm not underestimating the importance of Korean Peninsula issue, but as a whole, for the entire humanity, for the entire world, this is a very important issue, but not very well known, unfortunately. So I thought about why the issue like MDGs, well now we have SDGs, these development goals are not getting enough attention from people. That's unfortunate. One reason is probably it has a lot of technicalities there. So you need to you need to know what you're talking about to understand it. So that's a little. In other words, you can say it's a little boring. So it's very tough for me to discuss these issues in an interesting way. But I will do my best. So I will. One way of trying to make it a little more interesting is to use PowerPoint. So I will start with the background and Millennium Development Goals, because Millennium Development Goals have been there for the last 15 years. And now we have, as I said, Sustainable Development Goals. In the UN, as you know, we love acronyms. So we use acronyms like MDGs, SDGs. We are never short of acronyms. And then I will go into a little more details and give you what this new agenda is about. And finally, I will talk about ECOSOC's role in this. I'm not talking about ECOSOC's role because I'm president of ECOSOC. Well, that's true, but not because I have soft spot for ECOSOC, but because ECOSOC, you will understand later, ECOSOC was given a very important and very hard to achieve goal, duty, by the whole UN membership when it comes to this new development agenda. In some way by accident, and in another way by default. But we will understand this later. A little bit of background. In the UN Charter, I always think that having dealt with UN issues for many years, almost 30 years, I always think that Alex Ilyichev there worked in the UN more than 30 years, but I always think the founders of the United Nations are very wise men, wise people, because as you know, the UN came into being in 1945 after the two world wars, and by then people were, of course, sick and tired of wars, and the two wars put together killed almost 80 million people in the world. That's a lot, isn't it? So they realized, and the Second World War ended with the use of the atomic bombs, and they realized that 80 million people died from the two wars, but that's just a peanut if we really start to use these atomic bombs in a serious way. They saw the use of the bombs. So the absolute the most important purpose of the United Nations was to prevent another war. So the UN Charter said, UN was created to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. We haven't had a third world war, so in that sense, I think the United Nations achieved that goal. the second Secretary General who died in a plane crash in 1961, Dag Hammarskjöld, once said that the UN was not created to lead people to the heaven. It was created to prevent people from going to hell. You know? It's not the exact word, but he said something like this. So when it comes to the war, we have been saved from going to the hell, you know, because we haven't had the third world, even though we have had many small and medium-sized conflicts. But I said the founders of the United Nations were very wise and visionary as well, because they realized that to prevent another war, all these security arrangements are not enough, you know. You have to think of why people go to war from the beginning, why people get involved in conflict. For example, if some people are extremely poor, you know, starving to death, they have to worry about what to eat to survive. Then for these people, you know, the world as it is not acceptable. You want to change the world no matter what. And if you have a critical mass of these people who want to change the world no matter what, then you have what is called a very unstable world. And there are you know, it is very likely that we will have conflicts. And conflicts are often armed conflicts. And then we go into war. So they thought we need development. We need to give development to underdeveloped countries. So that's how the first pillar of the UN was peace and security, but the second pillar was development. And they also thought about human rights. You know, people are not just happy if they have food. You know, people need a minimum degree of human dignity. If people are jailed, prosecuted, tortured, then they are not happy, even if they have things to eat. So development is not good enough. You know, once again, if too many people are suffering from human rights violations, losing their human dignity, then you can easily have a critical mass of people who want to change the world, no matter what. So once again, if you have enough people who want to change the world, no matter what, then you have conflict. So they realized that. So the third pillar of the United Nations was human rights, promotion of human rights. But today we are talking about the second pillar, which is development. And in the UN Charter, they said, with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations, the United Nations shall promote higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress and development. This is a little abstract, a little vague, but they didn't have the problem like climate change yet. So from today's perspective, it sounds a little partial, but that's what they thought important that time. And in year 2000, we turned into new millennium, and everyone was excited about it, including the United Nations. So in the UN, you know, we wanted to have something very important for humanity, which was what was later called Millennium Development Goals. This is a set of 8 goals, and to be applied for the next 15 years. If you ask me why 15 years, why not 5 years, why not 10 years, why not 20 years, I don't know. Somehow they chose 15 years, you know. I don't know if Alex knows. Anyway, so that because they chose 15 years, we decide to do another 15 years. So the new goals we just adopted will be applied from next year through 2030. So this shows what is important here is the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, because they gave important guidelines for the new goals, which is about the environmental concern, climate change. So that's why we call the new goals sustainable development goals. Development should be sustainable. If it destroys the only earth we have, there's no point in getting development, So development should be pursued without destroying the earth. So that's why we call it sustainable development goals. If you look at the new old goals, they had the 8 goals, and you can notice that they are mostly about poverty, health, and social area like gender equality. So these are important, but these 8 goals did not cover the entire range of human activities. They chose specific goals and wanted to concentrate on them. I think these were quite good goals. In the UN, we don't adopt as concrete goals as these too often. There is a lot of rhetoric, but not much of concrete substance a lot of times, unfortunately. But this was very substantive. For example, it doesn't show here, but goal number 1 had a specific target like halve the proportion of people living on less than $1.25 a day. So they had a numeric target for everything. For example, goal number 4 had reduced by 2/3 the under 5 mortality rate. So these 8 goals, not all of them have been met, but at least more than half of them have been achieved by this year. So they had achievements and limitations. And what was considered limitations were, for example, focused too much on social development and lacked balance with economic and environmental dimensions. But that's understandable because environmental issue was not as big in year 2000 as it is now. So they couldn't reflect that those days. And also times have changed, and now we have emerging economies, more civil society engagement, and need for new global partnerships. So these things were considered in the new development goals. So this is new development goals, and 17 goals and 169 targets. When we were in the middle of negotiation, for example, early this year, a lot of people, including myself, thought that 17 goals are too many, especially because we had the very concrete 8 goals in MDGs. If we have 17 goals, then that's going to be more rhetoric than real goals. So we all thought, not all, but a lot of us thought 17 goals are too many. But when you have negotiations in the UN, some goals are, pet projects of a certain group of countries. The others are the other way around. So if you put all of them, you end up with more goals than you like to have. But now, come to think of it, I think it is also meaningful in a way because these 17 goals, the way I see it, covers every area of human activities. So very comprehensive. So we ended up with a very comprehensive goals, even though we didn't intend it in the beginning, but as a result of the negotiation, we have very comprehensive goals. No poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. The goal itself is longer than this, but to put it simply, it means basically these things: renewable energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, partnerships for goals. So if we pursue these 17 goals, hopefully we will be able to have sustainable development for all countries, leaving no one behind. If I may analyze it a little bit, this new document we adopted in September, there was a record number of heads of state in the UN, over 160, and they adopted these goals at the summit meeting there. It's composed of a preamble, SDGs and targets, means of implementation. Means of implementation means development financing. So to put it simply, where do we get the money? How we get the money? Means of implementation. And also follow-up and review. Follow-up and review is important because in the case of MDGs, there was no such provision. So the first review meeting of MDGs took place 4 years after its implementation. So this time around, we learned lessons. So we want to make sure that from the beginning, not only we implement goals, but also we want to follow up and review how we are doing. So characteristics of these new goals, new agenda is, first is universality. The MDGs were more about developing countries. So it was giving goals, targets for developing countries to achieve. And of course, developed countries will help them to achieve. But this is universal goals. Some of the goals are important for developed countries as well. For example, the goals about cities, goals about environmental protection. The environmental damages are more widespread in developed countries sometimes. So these goals are for both developed and developing countries. And the concept of no one will be left behind, especially marginalized segment of society and what is called the least developed countries in the world. And balance between three dimensions. Three dimensions is used to be economic, social dimension. That's why my council is called Economic and Social Council. But now we realize that the third dimension, environmental dimension, is important and should be a cross-cutting factor for all the activities of ECOSOC. So those three dimensions should be harmonized. Specific means of implementation. Means of implementation means, like I said, how we get the money for development. Multi-tiered follow-up and review framework. Multi-stakeholder partnership. Multi-stakeholder partnership basically means civil society, business sector, academia, like Korea society. And so all these, now we realize that the governments cannot pursue such important goals by themselves. They need, all segments of society as their partners. That's why we call them multi-stakeholder partnership. The Republic of Korea, South Korea, had the focuses during the negotiations. The negotiations lasted almost 3 years. And we had our focuses. In negotiations, you cannot have all the goals as you like. So you need to have your points of interest, concern. So these were them, and we thought rule of law or governance are important, which is reflected in goal number 16. It was not easy because developing countries had a great deal of suspicion about this particular goal. So they thought, well, the developed countries are trying to impose democracy on developing countries, and what does it have to do with development? That's developing countries' argument. Developed countries' argument, where Korea is also, when it comes to this debate, we belong to developed countries. Our argument is that, even from our own experience, it is important to have, efficient governance, government institutions that are not corrupt. So even if you give a lot of aid, development assistance to certain countries, if they don't have a good enough governance, then the money you give them will be in the Swiss bank for their leaders, which is a very inefficient way of using assistance money. It's not going to help your development. So that's why rule of law and governance are important in development. It's not political issue. It's also development issue. And the second point we thought important was education. These are more or less based on our own experience. We think governance is important because governance played a role in our own development process. We think education is important because education played an important role in our own development. So when I was a kid, even though Korean parents were starving, they still sent their children to school because they want their children to have a better future than they had. Rural development, what we have what we call Semaul Rundong, and that made a difference. Rural development, Semaul Rundong is basically about self-help. These rural communities need to help themselves. Only when they help themselves, the government will provide assistance. So that's the concept. And rights of persons with disabilities, not only because I am serving as a president of CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but because South Korea contributed a lot to the creation of this convention in 2008. And we are the one who put the clause on women with disabilities. If you ask me how come Korea has such devotion to this issue, I don't know, but probably because traditionally civil society has been very strong in Korea. During our democratization process, throughout our modern history, NGOs were pretty strong. In our own way, not NGOs as part of global civil society, but in our own way, NGOs played a lot of role. Sometimes as a opposition to the dictatorship, but they have a very strong, aggressive, sometimes militant tradition, and civil society organizations devoted to disability issues are pretty active and strong as well. So that probably explains. And shared responsibility between developing and developed countries, development effectiveness and partnership. We hosted a meeting 3 years ago called Busan Global Partnership meeting. We adopted what is called the Busan Global Partnership. So that also has to do with the number one, importance of governance. We need the partnership with the business sector, civil society. So not just government can, achieve development. Follow-up and review. I already explained to you that follow-up and review were not there in MDGs. It's a new thing for SDGs. Oops, I missed. No. So implementation, as I said, this is a set of goals that are supposed to be implemented by both developing and developed countries. So all UN member states should have their national implementation plan. So we have, we meaning Republic of Korea, also have our national implementation plan. And there are, UN platforms for implementations, like UN is providing global indicators, technology facilitation, and so on. And also, what is important here is another acronym, HLPF, High Level Political Forum. I need to explain a little more about this because in the Rio Plus 20 meeting in 2012, Rio Plus 20 meeting means there was a Rio meeting 20 years ago. So Rio Plus 20 is 20 years after the Rio meeting. We have another Rio meeting in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So that's Rio Plus 20 meeting we had 3 years ago. And at that meeting, of course, the meeting was devoted to climate change issues and sustainable development. That meeting, they gave guidelines to this new set of goals, SDGs. They said it's going to be called SDGs. So that's why we are calling it, SDGs. And at that meeting, also the leaders, heads of state, gathered in Rio de Janeiro, and they provided, political leadership, and they agreed to establish high-level political forum. But developing countries wanted to have this high-level political forum as an independent body with its own institution and budget. But developed countries had different opinion. Even though we are going to have HLPF, we shouldn't establish new institution. We should utilize institutions we already have. Then, which institution? And they pointed to, how about ECOSOC? Economic and Social Council. We have ECOSOC, so why don't we hold HLPF under the auspices of ECOSOC every year? And every 4 years, it's going to be held under the auspices of General Assembly. So that's why I told you that ECOSOC plays an important role in these new SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Well, in South Korea, we also have our implementation plans, especially if you look at the bottom. President Park Geun-hye, who came to New York a few weeks back, she announced that we will have a project called Better Life for Girls Initiative. So we will provide $200 million over the next 5 years for this particular project, which is to help girls all over the world in developing countries to have a better life. What is ECOSOC's role? As I said, ECOSOC is important because HLPF, High-Level Political Forum, which is product of Rio Plus 20 meeting, and which is the most important body that will supervise the implementation of these new goals, will be held under the auspices of ECOSOC. So I will be not only president of ECOSOC, but president of HLPF for next year, because mine is 1 year presidency, and my successor will be president of ECOSOC and HLPF the year after. And there are development-related forums like Financing for Development Forum and special meeting on international cooperation on tax. Multi-stakeholder is, as I explained, is a UN jargon used for private sector civil society. And the last one is special meeting on the issue of inequality, and that I will explain in the context of my own priorities as ECOSOC president. I was elected ECOSOC president on July 24, and I gave 4 priorities as ECOSOC president. And the first priority was to make ECOSOC more relevant to what is actually happening in the world. In the United Nations, we sometimes feel that we are having the same debate again and again. And sometimes, I have been posted in UN mission 3 times before. So this is my 4th time. And when I sometimes have a UN meeting, I feel like, am I in 2015 or 1995, Because this is deja vu feeling, you have the same debate 20 years ago. And actually, that's not deja vu feeling because we are having the same debate again. So what I suggested is we should be discussing things that have to do with what is happening in the world. For example, if there is financial crisis in the world, the UN should pick it, at least one body of the United Nations should pick up crisis and discuss it on time. The World Bank does it, the IMF does it. Why not the United Nations? The United Nations sometimes have agenda item like lessons from financial crisis, lessons from some others. Well, lessons are important, but how come we are always doing lessons? We should be actually discussing the issue. And even if we cannot agree on what kind of action we will take, still we have to discuss it. The fact that we are discussing these issues itself is very important. So as an example of the first priority of mine, I suggested to hold a special meeting of ECOSOC on the issue of inequality next March. So I'm getting pretty good responses from member states. Inequality is an important issue, not only for developing countries, but developed countries as well. I think one of President Obama's important concerns is also the issue of inequality. In the world, there are rich people and poor people, rich countries and poor countries. The gap is widening. 1% of the world population now possess half of the all wealth in the world. And the gap is getting wider. We have to think about why is it so, There could be several explanations, but by looking at these issues, I suggest that we should look at structural aspects of the problem. If there are rich countries and poor countries, rich countries help poor countries. That's what is called the development assistance. Like I said, that's one of the 3 pillars of the United Nations. That's important. We should continue to do that. But from time to time, we should look at whether we have the right rules of game. If we don't have right rules of game, no matter how many times you play the game, no matter how much development assistance you provide, it's not going to bring the effect you would like to see. That's why sometimes we need to look at structural issues. Some people told me that you sound like Piketty, but it's not Piketty style approach, It's important for everyone. And I have a good response from our US colleagues as well. So we will have this meeting next March, not only among governments, but also civil society, business sector. Even some business sector, even in New York City, they have a lot of interest in this issue, because even for rich segment of society, it is important to address this issue. If they realize that if they don't address this issue now, and then the gap widens, like I explained in the beginning, there will be critical mass of people who want to change no matter what. So some rich people already realize that. So they better address it now. The number 2 priority I gave out was successful implementation of 2030 development agenda. I already gave you enough explanation on this, HLPF and all these things, so I will skip it. Number 3 priority is strengthen and harmonize the work of the ECOSOC system as a whole. ECOSOC has 28 subsidiary bodies. These bodies were all created by ECOSOC, but some of them are pretty big, like economic and social commissions, like ESCOP. All the 5 regions of the world have economic and social commissions. So they are pretty big, by themselves, and some subsidiary bodies have been there for many, many years, as old as the United Nations itself. So it's good that they have their own dynamics, but there is a increasing lack of coordination, because these bodies are doing things on their own. They forgot that they were created by the ECOSOC. They report to ECOSOC every year, but it's sometimes very superficial. So I thought that we need more coordination as a system, among all these bodies. And the last one is the engagement of multi-stakeholders. I already told you about it, so I will skip it. And thank you.